Today, Peter Rachleff is going to speak about the history of general strikes in the United States. Peter Rachleff is a nationally known historian, a former professor of history at Macalaster College, and works very closely with Eastside Freedom Library. And yeah, we're just really thrilled to have him here, and it's going to be a really great presentation. And then after his presentation, there's going to be open Q&A, because I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. There's a lot of ground to cover here. And just want to also shout out, this is in anticipation of May 1st. So, no work, no school, no shopping that day. So be ready, start organizing, and hope you all enjoy learning a little bit of this history.
Thank you, Drew, and thank you all for coming. I'm still struggling with recovering from back surgery, and so it's easier for me to sit than to stand, so that's why I'm sitting. But I want to begin by thanking MN50501. I want to thank the Hennepin County Library staff, members of AFSCME Local 2822. I want to thank people active with the Workers' Assembly, with the Workers' Solidarity Committee, with the Black Cat Workers Collective, with the DSA Labor Branch, and lots of individual unions. I also want to give a shout out to a couple of other labor historians, authors in the House. John Hanson will soon have his first book coming out about his dad and the 1934 Minneapolis Teamsters strike. And Dave Camper, the author of Who's Got the Power, which came out, maybe 5 months ago? Ish, yeah. And I'm thrilled that Dave is here. We did a great event with him at the Eastside Freedom Library, and highly recommend his book, again titled Who's Got the Power. We're also going to, and I also want to especially thank Amy Staker and Keith Christensen, who tomorrow will be doing a program online through the Labor Education Service at the University of Minnesota about the history of Minnesota workers fighting against fascism. Amy will say a little bit more about that later this evening. But I appreciate so much is going on, and for a couple of days we were fearful that we had two events happening at the same time, and Amy and Keith were extraordinarily gracious and moved their event from today to tomorrow. So I hope you'll all plug in. I certainly will be. And of course, I want to thank our immigrant neighbors and rank and file workers who have been standing with them over the last 6 months. All of us calling for ICE out. But also, and part of what I really want to talk about today, is building for a movement, building for a community in which we can live with the security and respect and camaraderie that we want to live with. So my theme for today is supposedly general strikes in American history. And although I feel that what I want to talk about today is very much tied to May 1st and beyond May 1st, I want to think about it more broadly than just the term general strike. We've already begun to be creative in our language back for January 23rd, talking about no work, no school, no shopping. And what I really want to try to do today is use some historical examples, but to encourage us all to think about the ways that American workers have built power in the past, in the present, and in the future. And I'm going to tell some stories that I suspect, though I know some of you in the house and know that you've been reading and learning over the years, but some of these stories hopefully will be new to you and stimulating in thinking not just about the content, but thinking about how do we think about class struggle in the United States, and how can we further the goal of promoting class struggle. And so I want to start by suggesting a kind of framework for thinking. And part of it is, many of you who know me know that I like to talk about putting the past and the present in a conversation with each other. And so the past isn't, as Faulkner said, just past, it's still part of the present. And I think in putting the past and the present in a conversation, new things can emerge, new things can strike us about both the past and the present, and hopefully then about thinking about the future. Now, when I began to study labor history in the mid-1970s with a great teacher named David Montgomery, David said very early on in our labor history work at the University of Pittsburgh, it was 1975, and we were beginning to look at the Knights of Labor in the 1880s. And David said, you know, if I said labor movement about the 1880s, I would have to talk about at least 5 different kinds of organizations. Mutual benefit societies, reform organizations like the organizations at that time fighting for the 8-hour day, producer cooperatives, labor political parties, and unions. Said if I said labor movement, we'd have to talk about all these kinds of organizations. Said, but if I said labor movement in 1975, I'd only be talking about unions. And part of what's made me recall David's point and some of its implications is how much if we talk about a labor movement in 2026, we're talking about lots of kinds of organizations and activities. Mutual aid groups, grocery delivery groups, groups patrolling schools. We look at the work that the Minnesota Federation of Educators and the St. Paul Federation of Educators have done, organizing parents and community members to protect kids in schools. The labor movement today consists of a wide range of organizations, not just unions. I also want to suggest that we think about a term that my old friend Jeremy Brecker has used, what he calls social strikes, rather than using the term general strikes. So social strikes as struggles that build bridges between workplaces and communities, bring together workers who are not yet in unions as well as those who are, and address issues beyond wages, benefits, grievance procedures, collective bargaining, and contracts. Jeremy has for a number of years been involved with the Labor Network for Sustainability. I encourage you to take a look at their work, but also look at this concept of social strikes that he talks about. And finally, and this may be the most challenging idea of all, I found the last several years in teaching labor history that I try not to talk about single struggles, like the Great Railroad Strike of 1877, or the Great Northern Railroad Strike of 1894, or the St. Paul, Minneapolis trolley strike of 1917. I try not to think about them as being either victories or defeats. And instead, what I try to ask is, what did the people who participated in them learn? And how did they pass on what they learned to a next generation of working people? And I think that maybe I'm trying to weasel out of the fact that most of the great events that we talk about ended up with, workers getting shot on the picket lines and some people being thrown behind bars and all of that. But I still think that what gets learned in those struggles and how it gets taught to a next generation, and whether, I've been greatly moved by a recent book that a young scholar musician named Ben Barson has written called Grassroots Democracy. And it's about the role of music in the development of racial justice and class struggle in New Orleans. And Ben writes about how escaped enslaved people in the Caribbean traveled from the Dominican Republic to Haiti, to Cuba, to Puerto Rico, to parts of Mexico, to New Orleans, and what they had to share with others about how to get away. Where were the safe places to go? Where were the strategies that might work? And then Ben makes this wonderful case that the way they communicated what they had learned and wanted to teach was through music. And maybe one of the reasons I've fallen in love with Ben's book is that we're blessed with a group called Brass Solidarity here in the Twin Cities, and what a great role that they've been playing in the movement. And Ben makes the great argument that you can even teach what you have to teach without lyrics. And the music alone and the engaging with the music becomes a way of teaching and learning. So I'm very interested. I want to walk us through a couple of historical events and talk about what people learned and how they taught it. And so I wanted to start actually, I remembered W.E.B. Du Bois. So in 1935, the year after the 34 Minneapolis Teamster strikes, the year of the Strugwear strike here, the year of great strikes in San Francisco and Toledo, the Du Bois undertook the task of writing a book that he titled Black Reconstruction in America. And in chapter 4 of Black Reconstruction, Du Bois argued that enslaved people engaged in a general strike during the Civil War. He estimated that 500,000 out of the 4 million enslaved men, women, and children, that 500,000 of them struck, ran away, presented themselves to the Union Army. We know that 180,000 African American men fought for the Union Army during the Civil War. And Du Bois makes the case in Black Reconstruction that the first general strike in America was a strike by enslaved people striving for freedom. And he points out that, and I was reminded of this too, I don't know if you're familiar with Jelani Cobb, who teaches at Columbia University and writes for the New Yorker magazine. Jelani had two great pieces in the last couple months connecting the struggle in Minneapolis to the Underground Railroad and to the struggle against the Fugitive Slave Act. And so in 1850, the United States Congress passed a law called the Fugitive Slave Act that said that enslavers and bounty hunters, and we've had bounty hunters here recently, but that enslavers and bounty hunters could present themselves anywhere in the North, even where slavery was illegal, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and they could say, this individual is my property. And under the Fugitive Slave Act, the local police, and the issue of the police collaborating with those outside authorities, right? History repeating itself, or rhyming again, as Faulkner would have said. That in 1862, because of the direct action by hundreds of thousands of enslaved men and women, Congress passed what was called the First Confiscation Act, which overruled the Fugitive Slave Act, that said now if you had escaped from slavery and made it to a free state, you could not be returned to your enslaver. A year later, in January of 1863, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. These were consequences of the direct action taken by hundreds of thousands of enslaved men and women, some of them escaping by water, as Marcus Rediker shows so brilliantly in his new book, The Freedom Ship, some of them escaping by land, many of them presenting themselves to the Union Army, where they also demanded wages if they were going to help free other enslaved African Americans. So this is how I begin thinking about social strikes, general strikes, the issues that were being addressed, the power of direct action. Now, the term general strike gets picked up very intentionally in 1886. Actually, general strike gets picked up in 1886. It's in 1882 that the precursor to the AFL, the so-called Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Associations, calls for an 8-hour day and proposes that all workers in the United States should have an 8-hour day, and that the idea begins to develop that on May 1st, 1886, all workers in the United States should go on strike, and no workers should return to work until all of those workers have the 8-hour day. The center of that struggle became the largest factory in the United States, the McCormick Harvester Works in Chicago. The Industrial Revolution in the United States was reaching into agriculture. McCormick was producing reapers, particularly for wheat farms. That became the center of the strike. A group of people people around Albert Parsons, Louis Ling, Albert Spies, mostly German immigrants. Albert Parsons had migrated from the South to Chicago. They organized for the 8-hour day, and on May 1st, when they went on strike and put up a picket line at the McCormick Harvester Works, the military showed up and the police and opened fire on the strikers, and it killed a number of them. 4 days later, there was a protest demonstration in response, and someone, to this day, we still don't know who it was, someone threw a bomb, it exploded and killed several police, and the leaders of the movement were arrested, charged with murder, ultimately convicted and executed as a consequence of that. That was 1886. When did the 8-hour day become the reality in the United States? Phil Qualley was what?
34.
1934, it's actually 1936. 50 years later, 50 years before the 8-hour day actually becomes a reality. Does that mean the 1886 struggle was a failure? I want to suggest no. That workers around the United States practiced solidarity, learned about solidarity, and began to apply that in their own communities. And I want to talk about two examples. One is the subject that I wrote my PhD dissertation about, and that was the Knights of Labor in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia had not only been the capital of the Confederacy, but it had had the largest number of enslaved men and women working in factories before the Civil War. And I got drawn to researching Richmond because I wanted to know what happened after emancipation. Did African Americans keep their jobs? Did they organize unions? How did the white workers relate to African American workers? And I discovered something amazing, something that I've spent the last 40 years trying to get people in Richmond, Virginia to listen to. Largely unsuccessful, I'm sorry to say. And I found that in 1886, the same year as the fight for the 8-hour day, the African American and white organization of the Knights of Labor in Richmond, Virginia, organized a third party that they called the Workingmen's Reform Party. They entered politics over a particular issue. The issue was the city government was going to build a new city hall. And the Knights of Labor went out to organize door to door and said, if the city is going to build a new city hall, it should be built out of local material by local workers. They should be employed directly by the city and not by private contractors. They should be employed on the 8-hour day. They should earn a living wage. And in the language of that day, colored workers should have the opportunity for skilled jobs on that project, along with white workers. And when they presented, they got 7,000 people to sign their petition. They presented it to the city government, and the city council said, in language that Ronald Reagan would have well understood, we would be fiscally irresponsible if we tried to build a city hall the way you've called for. And so the Knights of Labor said, while they were organizing for the 8-hour day, while they were reading labor newspapers that talked about fights for the 8-hour day all across the country, the Knights of Labor said, we're going to start our own political party, we're going to run for city council, we're going to take over the local government. And they did. And they were successful. And then they built the new city hall precisely the way they had said they wanted to. The 8-hour day became a reality for workers working on that project and a model for them. Later in 1886, the Knights of Labor held their national convention in Richmond, Virginia. They were welcomed by white and black members of the Knights of Labor. White delegates to the Knights of Labor National Convention refused to stay in hotels that were Jim Crow. African Americans opened their homes for white delegates to the convention to stay with them. There was a great incident in Richmond. The delegates from Brooklyn, New York, had come to Richmond by boat, came down the Atlantic coast, and on the ship, they met a drama troupe that was coming to Richmond to stage Hamlet. And the drama troupe gave free tickets to the delegates from Brooklyn to come see Hamlet. And when they came to see the play, they discovered that the great Richmond Theater, the most prominent theater outside of New Orleans in the South, that the theater was Jim Crow. And the members of the Knights of Labor said, fuck no. We're not going to sit by Jim Crow in this theater. We demand the right to watch Hamlet, sitting with our brothers and sisters, whatever race they may be. These were people who had been moved by the struggle for the 8-hour day. Let me come closer to home. East side of St. Paul. Workers working on the Great Northern Railroad, owned by that late 19th century term robber baron, early 21st century term oligarch, James J. Hill, that when the American economy slid into a depression in 1893, James J. Hill responded to the depression by laying off a bunch of workers, by increasing the workload for the workers who still had jobs, and by cutting the wages for the workers who were still working. And so they went on strike. And the center of the strike was Payne Avenue on the east side of St. Paul. And workers would meet and sing. And at the end of their meetings, coming out of 896 Payne Avenue, they would march down Payne Avenue to the overpass over the railroad tracks, and they would dump garbage on the tracks. So the trains being driven by strikebreakers or scabs could not get through. And this created a really interesting crisis for the oligarchs of St. Paul, or Minneapolis and St. Paul. Mr. Pillsbury, who had the most successful flour milling industry in the country, in fact in the world, was shipping his flour from the riverfront of Minneapolis to the waterfront of Duluth, where they were put on ocean-going ships and barrels of flour, and shipped across Lake Superior, where the flour undersold flour that was being milled in Europe. And Pillsbury went to Hill and said, "You're making a mess of my business." And Hill agreed to the first ever third-party arbitration of a strike. And Pillsbury volunteered to be the arbitrator. And Hill thought he had it in the bag. And lest we stay awake at night worrying about solidarity among the capitalists, don't be so sure. And Pillsbury stuck it to Hill. He wanted the strike over as fast as possible. And Hill had agreed that he would accept whatever the arbitrator said. And he was ordered to bring back all the workers he had laid off, to return the wages to the level that they had been before the layoffs. And the word spread. And those workers who worked for Hill, one of the lessons they had learned from 1886 was that railroad workers were stronger if they were all in one union than if they were in 12 different unions. The engineers, the firemen, the brakemen, the switchmen, the conductors, the maintenance away workers. And an interesting character from Terre Haute, Indiana, named Eugene Victor Debs. His mom and dad had given him the middle name Victor to connect him to the legacy of the writer Victor Hugo. So we have Hamlet, we have Victor Hugo. This is all part of it too. And Debs started a union. He was a railroad fireman, and he started a union 2 years after the fight for the 8-hour day, called the American Railway Union, that all railroad workers should come together in one union. In the wake of the strike of the Great Northern Railroad workers in April of 1894, 125,000 railroad workers joined Debs's American Railway Union. A bunch of them were workers who worked manufacturing Pullman cars, sleeping cars, in the town of Pullman. So the product itself is called Pullman, the town is called Pullman, and he followed the script that Hill had tried to implement in 1893, that he would cut his workers' wages, lay off a bunch of workers, and he also happened to be their landlord, and he happened to own the grocery stores. And lo and behold, the workers in Pullman said something that generation after generation of American workers have said, and I find it so intriguing that it's the language. They said, "That's not fair." And I went, where did they get the idea that life was supposed to be fair? And they said, well, it's not fair for you to cut our wages but not reduce our rent. It's not fair for you to cut our wages and not reduce the price of groceries. And so they reached out to Debs. And they said, we hear you're the guy that says all railroad workers ought to be in one union. We'd like to join your union. We don't actually work on moving trains. We build sleeping cars. Can we join your union? And Debs said, sure. And then they sent him another telegram. And they said, oh, we should also tell you that we're already on strike. And Debs said, that's great. That's great. And he called for, and it's interesting when we've discussed no work, no school, no shopping, and the word boycott. And the word boycott got introduced to the American labor movement by Irish immigrants. It was Irish immigrants who first used the tactic of a boycott in fighting against the British colonizers. And Debs took that term and he called for, and it's interesting too because I'm looking at my friend Kip Hedges, and I think we know that people have struggled with using the word strike for January 23rd, or using the word strike for May 1st, and maybe we should call it something different, and because now we have contracts in which some unions have signed contracts that say we promise not to strike for the duration of the company. And so Debs called for a nationwide boycott by railroad workers, but he didn't mean a boycott of choosing not to ride in a Pullman car, since that was too expensive for most working class people anyway. He wanted railroad workers to refuse to move any train that had a Pullman car on it. And interestingly, because Mr. Pullman has a good oligarch, like his friends Hill and Pillsbury, he had a monopoly. And there was no separation in the late 19th century between freight trains and passenger trains. So virtually every train had at least one Pullman car. And so Debs was calling for a nationwide railroad strike, but calling it a boycott. Mr. Pullman then went out and got himself a new lawyer. He hired the former Attorney General of the United States, a guy named Richard Olney, and Olney went looking for a sympathetic judge. This is why I like to talk about a conversation between the past and the present. Sounds pretty familiar. And Olney figured out that not only did every train have a Pullman car, but almost every train had a postal mail car. And they went to a judge in Chicago and said, like, God forbid, this strike is interfering with the shipment of the nation's mail. And that federal judge in Chicago then issued the first ever federal injunction against a strike. And he had Debs hauled into court and ordered Debs to call off the strike. And Debs refused. And the judge found him in contempt. Now, in 1986, like 90 years later, when the workers went on strike at Hormel in Austin, and they were threatened with contempt by a judge, Judge Edward Davies, a Republican-appointed judge. The union in Austin called up the historian, and they said, what does it mean that they're threatening us with contempt? And at first I thought, like probably many of you, I had watched too many TV shows where some crusading journalist is found in contempt by a judge, she's taken to jail, and by the next commercial she's out. Didn't seem like such a big thing. Well, I did a little bit of research and found Debs spent 18 months in prison because he refused to call off the strike. During those 18 months, I loved telling students that he read Marx's Capital. And then I said, it shouldn't take you 18 months to read Capital. Some of us, perhaps. So then Mr. Olney, because Debs refused to call off the strike, Mr. Olney went to the President of the United States, Grover Cleveland, and said, this strike is not only interfering with the shipment of the mail, screwing up the whole American economy, and Grover Cleveland decides to send the military to Pullman, the suburb of Chicago, to break the picket lines and break the strike. And the military shows up and opens fire. 37 picketers are killed by the US military. Debs is in prison. The strike falls apart. And then I find, picturing the Oval Office, which we see, no, Jesus was not there. The Oval Office. And Grover Cleveland, his lawyer, Mr. Olney, his advisors are all sitting there. And one of them says, man, you shot yourself in the foot. How are you going to get reelected after you sent the military and they killed 37 strikers? And another one of them says, I have an idea. Why don't you create a national Labor Day holiday? And then you'll get the working class vote. And that summer of 1894, President Grover Cleveland announced that the first Monday after the first Tuesday in September henceforth would be Labor Day. And he didn't get reelected. So, but this was the lessons of solidarity, of sticking together, that workers had learned in the fight for the 8-hour day in 1886, that carried into the electoral campaign in Richmond, Virginia, and other cities, that carried into the Great Northern Strike and the Pullman boycott in 1894. These became part of what working people in the labor movement in the United States understood the labor movement to be about, understood what they might need to undertake. I want to jump ahead and tell two more stories before I quit. So the Great Depression begins in 1929. In 1932, early 1932, a bunch of working class World War I veterans come together and say, you know, when we left the military after World War I, Congress passed a bill promising us a bonus for having left the military before the term that we had been drafted to serve, before the term was up. Now, that was 1924 that the bill was passed. The fine print actually said that they would get that bonus in 1945. And a bunch of unemployed World War I veterans in early 1932 said, we need that bonus now. Let's go to Washington, D.C. and protest outside of Congress and the White House until they agree to pay us our bonus. We deserve it. And, let me see if I have the numbers. 43,000 people went to Washington, D.C. See, one of the reasons we might also call that a general strike is people weren't going to work. They were going to D.C. to protest. And they set up the first tent colony protest in the United States, a tactic that the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa would use decades later, learning from what had been done in the United States. 17,000 of the 43,000 were veterans, although sounding like another resident of the White House, Herbert Hoover at the time said, I don't believe they're really veterans. You know, can they prove it? Huh? So, Hoover picked his favorite general, Douglas MacArthur. And Douglas MacArthur took American troops and tear gassed and shot World War I veterans in the streets of Washington. One of the things that I've learned about the bonus army, from having had the good fortune to talk with some people who had participated, is the way they got to Washington. Like, it took a long time. They hitchhiked. They hopped on freight trains. They didn't have money to go to McDonald's. They didn't bring food with them. That periodically they got off the road or the railroad and they went door to door and told their stories to the people who answered the door. How they had risked their lives for democracy in World War I. How they were being cheated by the government. How they wanted what they would do. And how that would then influence the people who were hearing those stories. How they might vote. What political activism they might undertake. And then they went back after they got chased out of Washington. Again, knocking on doors and telling their stories. In the fall of 1932, Herbert Hoover didn't get reelected. Franklin Delano Roosevelt got elected. This was the beginning of what would be called the New Deal. As government programs got created, and I think you're going to hear from Amy and Keith tomorrow about the 1934 Teamster strikes. I'm not going to say much about it today. But some of those strikers were people who had been in the bonus army, were people who had knocked on other people's doors, or people who had heard those stories coming from veterans. And so when the activists in the Teamsters Union in Minneapolis began to organize, they didn't just organize truck drivers and helpers and warehouse workers, but they also organized unemployed workers, people who didn't have jobs at the moment, because they had worked with them in the bonus army, because they knew what it meant to have a labor movement that connected the workplace and the community. They knew that that was where strength came from in the labor movement. One more story. Among the people who were touched by all of this were people like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin. In St. Paul, a guy named Frank Boyd. Also in St. Paul, in South St. Paul, an African-American guy named Frank Alsop, who had come out of Cedar Rapids. They had been touched by the bonus army. They had been touched by railroad workers' struggles. They began to organize. And in 1941, they put their heads together and came up with what they called the March on Washington movement. And they said, while the United States had not yet entered World War II, the Japanese had not yet bombed Pearl Harbor, which was right. Trump thought he was there or something in Pearl Harbor. That was another fantasy. But the discourse was growing in the United States about fascism and democracy. And A. Philip Randolph, and before A. Philip Randolph became a labor organizer, he was a Shakespearean actor. not something many people know about Randolph. And Randolph came up with a slogan, what he called the double V: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. And the March on Washington movement called for the federal government under Franklin Delano Roosevelt to integrate the military. Did you know that even though the North won the Civil War, that the American military was Jim Crow until 1942? Not something that they typically teach us in school. And Randolph and Boyd and Baird Rustin called for integrating the U.S. military, and also insisted that any private contractor who got military contracts to make weapons, support for the U.S. military, they didn't have the DEI yet as a term, but basically that they would practice equal opportunity employment in their industries. And Randolph said it might be embarrassing for the United States government if, while they're posturing about fighting for democracy, and their goal was to get 100,000 African Americans to come to Washington, D.C. It could be embarrassing to get 100,000 black folk in Washington, D.C. protesting against racism in the United States. And a week before the march was supposed to begin, which was July 1, 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave in and issued Executive Order 8803, decreeing that the military would be integrated, decreeing that no Jim Crow would be tolerated on the part of military contractors. That became part of the legacy that Randolph and Boyd got fired from the Pullman Company for being a labor agitator, and so he got a job in a meatpacking plant in South St. Paul. And he and his next door neighbor, Frank Alsop, became organizers in the Packing House Workers Union in South St. Paul. And it would not be a coincidence that in 1955, the United Packing House Workers Union would send a delegation to Money, Mississippi, to witness the trial of the men who, in the Klan, who were accused of murdering Emmett Till. So what gets learned in these struggles, what gets passed on, what becomes resources that people work with. And as probably all of you in the room are familiar with, we heard a lot from friends and family around the country the last 4 or 5 months about how amazing it must be to be in Minnesota and how unique Minnesotans are, and that idiot Tom Friedman wrote a piece that has something to do with winters, and what a sorry-ass piece that he wrote. And I've been trying to say, and today is my big opportunity to say, it's what got passed on from the 1886 fight for the 8-hour day, the 1894 fight against James J. Hill and Pullman, and the Minneapolis Teamsters fight, and the strutwear knitting workers fight, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Read Evelyn Fairbanks' memoir about growing up an African-American woman in St. Paul, and the centrality of the sleeping car porters. The president of the Ladies Auxiliary, the National Ladies Auxiliary of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, in the 1940s and 1950s was a woman from St. Paul, Carrie McWatt, Arthur McWatt's mom. Arthur and his partner Katie would become major activists in the civil rights movement here in the Twin Cities. And we all stand on others' shoulders. And it's frustrating to be a historian and know that a lot of this doesn't get taught. A lot of this is not in the curriculum. And maybe someday, we'll be demanding that it is, and we will see that. So, I think January 23rd, for those of us that participated in different ways in that, we're standing on the shoulders of people who engaged in these other struggles. And so when we think about May 1st, I want to encourage us to think about the organizing that gets us to May 1st. The knocking on doors. The God help us, sending texts and doing it remotely. But the conversations that we can have, the ideas and experiences and stories that we can share, and how that will not only make May 1st a learning experience for the people who participate, but it will become a building block for what's going to come after May 1st, what we're going to be able to do in the months and the years ahead. So that conversation between the past and the present. So before we open up for questions, Amy, you want to say a little bit about what's happening tomorrow? Sure. And Drew's got a mic.
It's always such a grounding thing to hear you speak about labor history. Stories I haven't heard, stories I have heard. Yeah, it's great to be able to share this with all of you in the room. My name is Amy Stager. I work for the Labor Education Service at the University of Minnesota. We work with unions and worker centers on different trainings, and we also do media. So we've been writing about worker struggles. And we also do classes. So we have a class tomorrow on workers in Minnesota fighting fascism throughout history. And so we've got 3 examples. We're going to dig really deep into that. And Keith Christensen is going to be co-facilitating with me. He has a wealth of knowledge in this area. We're going to talk about art and also have that conversation be about the past and the present coming together as well. So if anyone's interested, I have little flyers with QR codes. It's tomorrow, 5 to 6:30 p.m. and it's on Zoom. So you can join us and in whatever way you feel comfortable. But I would love to see you all there and get to talk more about worker power. Keith, I don't know if you want to say anything. Okay.
That's all right.
Yes, thanks Peter for letting me share.
Thank you. So, Drew, shall we take? I do want to play that song, and can we do that? So, a friend of mine named Steve Jones, who is a musician and a librettist. Steve wrote this remarkable musical in the early 2000s called Forgotten, Murder at the Fort Rouge, about what happened in the effort to unionize Ford Motor Company in 1937. And when he heard I was going to give this talk today, he sent me a recording of a new song that he's written. And Beth and I are going to make you all sing. So And especially if Drew's able to make the tech work.
I haven't tried the sound yet, but
Uh-oh.
I mean, I know it will play something. I don't know how loud. I'm gonna wait until people got their sheets.
Okay.
Get started.
And you can go to YouTube and put in Forgotten, Murder at the Fort Rouge, and you can watch the whole musical for free on YouTube. It's awesome.
Are you ready?
Go for it.
A time-honored tradition, how about a general strike? A time-honored tradition, how about a general strike? A time-honored tradition, how about a general strike? Let's all put our tools down, how about a general strike? In our hands is placed the power, how about a general strike? In our hands is placed the power, how about a general strike? In our hands is placed the power, how about a general strike? Let's all put our tools down, how about a general strike? Puerto Rico did it, how about a general strike? Puerto Rico did it, how about a general strike? Puerto Rico did it, how about a general strike? Let's all put our tools down, how about a general strike? You know they can't jail us all, how about a general strike? No, they can't jail us all, how about a general strike? You know they can't jail us all, how about a general strike? Let's all put our tools down, how about a general strike? Nothing about us without us, how about a general strike? Nothing about us without us, how about a general strike? Nothing about us without us, how about a general strike? Let's all put our tools down, how about a general strike? It's Minneapolis gone, how about a general strike? It's Minneapolis gone, how about a general strike? It's Minneapolis gone, how about a general strike? Let's all put our tools down, how about a general strike? A time-honored tradition, how about a general strike? A time-honored tradition, how about a general strike? A time-honored tradition, how about a general strike? Let's all put our tools down, how about a general strike?
Great. So I'm easy to reach. I'm sure you'll be able to remember this for email. Just peter@eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. And if you would like the recording, I'll email it to you so that you can sing along with others. Spread the word like we would spread the stories. Thank you. So, Drew, questions?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, raise your hands and I'll run the mic over to you.
Thanks so much for that illuminating lecture. And I was just wondering if this was recorded because there are several people that I know would really enjoy hearing this, and a lot of people who would benefit from knowing more about this history.
So, what's your name?
Cookie?
Cookie's been recording this. So, and will you eventually send it to me? and to others. And so again, I'm happy to turn around and send it out to you. Unless, Drew, you have a sign up you want to get people to give you their emails, or?
We're probably gonna put it on our YouTube as well,
Oh, put it
Minnesota
on-
5051.
great.
But we'll also send it to you and then anyone else who reaches out to us, info@MN50501.org.
Great.
Hi, I was wondering if during your research about Richmond, if you ever were able to find out if doing things the way that the Knights of Labor wanted to, was it fiscally responsible?
So that was 1886. This is 2026. So it's 140 years ago. The building is still standing. It's a beautiful building. One of the things that struck me when I saw the building in the mid-1970s when I was doing my research was there were gargoyles at every corner of the roof. And I thought somebody got a job carving gargoyles because of the labor movement. So it's a beautiful building. The city government did not go bankrupt. They stayed afloat. But the building is still, it's no longer the city hall. It's now a state office building, but it's still standing. And it doesn't have, this is one of my favorite lines, it doesn't have a plaque that tells the story of how it came to be built. And I've been trying for 40 years to get a plaque in that building unsuccessfully. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your work and your work today. Would you like to share, as you recall, from the 1894 Great Northern Strike, who was Charles Luth and what was his legacy and story as a railroad martyr in St. Paul?
I think, Brother Phil, you should tell us.
Yeah.
So Brother Phil is a retired railroad worker and railroad union leader, who also participated in the creation of a play about Charlie Luth. And
Well,
What happened
everybody,
to
the railroad's a hell of a business. And thanks for covering what you have. It was 18, now correct me when I'm wrong, and Beth, please correct me when I'm wrong, but in the 1890s, you know, the power of the railroad was pretty remarkable. And the workers, as you explained, were getting undercut constantly. And the Great Northern Strike was going on. And there's an Omaha, Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul and Omaha railroad guy by the name of Charles Luth, who was kind of a rounder. He went between different railroads. And he was a strike agitator. He was a sympathizer, and he had a family of 3 kids. And right down where the St. Paul Farmers Market is, on Wall and 4th, where is the Chicago Northwestern and the Great Northern Railroad hubs by the yards there, he was a sympathy striker to the different strikes going on, which were local. And scabs were being brought in, and he tried to stop the scabs from going to a rooming house by a woman who had a large family with no husband and had to feed her kids, and he was trying to convince her not to take in scabs, and confronted the Chicago, Milwaukee, and Omaha agent at that rooming house, who shot him dead, 4 shots. What was remarkable then was that 8,000 people in St. Paul, the Knights of Pythias, the Knights of Labor, the city of St. Paul, all immigrants, walked him from his grave, from his funeral site in a parade up to Oakland Cemetery. And so, long story short, a railroad fatality. The attorney the railroad officer who shot him dead, was a railroad agent, and agents had strong political powers, think of the Pinkertons. And the prosecuting attorney was Pierce Butler. And, or was it the defense attorney was Pierce Butler, who, for the railroads. And after the special agent was acquitted, Pierce Butler became, I think, the Attorney General of the state of Minnesota. And we refer to James J. Hill, incidentally, as the rat bastard. Thank you.
Thank you. Drew?
I've got three for you. Do we know if this is gonna be, the song is public domain, first off? Because I would like my son to record it. And I'm in the process of starting a podcast on labor history, because there is no podcasts out there that cover our labor. The second one, would you quantify the Occupy movement in 2011 as a sort of a general strike that went nationwide? This and was active here in the Minneapolis area. I was an active part of Occupy Homes, where we were fighting back during the housing crisis and the foreclosure crisis and eviction crisis, saving people's houses. And I believe, my count, we saved 17 homes for people. Early 1980s, there was a major strike here called the Bureau of Engraving strike over in Northeast, where the Costco warehouse is now, business center is now. I worked in a small warehouse just behind the UPS building, and we would come up and participate in the line. The National Guard was brought out by Frazier, but if you try to look up anything on the Bureau of Engraving strike, and I have researched and researched, I can't find anything. There is nothing about this strike anywhere on the internet, anywhere in books that I've looked for, other than the few newspaper articles that you can find if you're able to access the Star Tribune or the Pioneer Press from that time. And why is that?
So, a couple of quick responses on Occupy. So, the Occupy movement also had a major influence in Wisconsin. And when the public sector unions in Wisconsin were threatened by Governor Scott Walker, and there was an occupation of the Capitol, many of us traveled to Madison to be supportive. So I think it's a great example of how what happens in one struggle feeds the next one that comes along, and a great example of what was not a labor struggle initially, the Occupy movement, becomes incorporated into the labor movement at that time. In terms of Bureau of Engraving, it's really interesting that you would raise it. First, there's, again, this point about how things get carried into the next struggle. Were you part of the working group on economic dislocation?
I was not. I worked at Paul Bunyan. We were told by the Teamsters 638, get up there and help the brothers. So I would go up there and stand on the Western Boulevard, Broadway,
Yeah,
and we would all
yeah.
raise out.
So when I moved here in 1982, and the energy in the labor movement in 1982 was largely coming from a group that called itself the Working Group on Economic Dislocation, and they were fighting plant closings, but many of them had also been involved in the Bureau of Engraving strike, and so they carried that into the next phase of the movement. And that, of course, then played a vital role in developing the support committee for the Hormel strikers in 1985-86. So those legacies got passed along. And specifically about Bureau of Engraving, do you remember an activist whose name was Brian, and I'm forgetting his last name. And his partner, he passed away probably more than a decade ago. But his partner has all of his papers, and she's working out, donating them to the Minnesota Historical Society. So there will soon be a very rich collection of documents about the Bureau of Engraving Strike. So it is. And the Historical Society, which has typically been a pain in the ass to deal with, but the staff there unionized 3 years ago, and now I have go-to people, the vice president of the local, the president of the local, and they're great about helping us get access to whatever labor materials they might have. Brian Link, L-I-N-K, Brian Link was the activist. And I know I had several car trips to Austin with Brian in 85, 86. Yeah, that was Kevin O'Keefe was in the midst of all of that too. He was long gone.
So I'm assuming most of us in here know about the DOJ, not exactly the president. The NSPM 7, the memorandum from Blondie, redefining what domestic terrorism is, including organized doxing of law enforcement, mass rioting, blah, 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 Antifa this, Antifa that. So my question is, it got me thinking, when you talk about history and the past and the present, has there been anything quite like that from the federal government defining in written record what the DOJ and the feds are going to do as far as what reaches criminal activity? I'm sure there has been. Just wondering if there's anything you can think of that would be a good parallel now, today, for us.
Yeah, so one of the really great things going on in our culture is something called National History Day. And middle school and high school kids, not all schools, some schools, participate in doing a research project and the kids create an interactive website, a solo performance piece, a 10-minute documentary video, now and then there's a kid who actually writes a paper. And last year, a young man who's a junior in high school in Eden Prairie won national first prize for an interactive website that he created about something called the Palmer Raids of 1921 that were Mr. Palmer was the Attorney General of the United States, and he went after the IWW in the wake of World War I. And so there have been some instances. I heard a talk 2 days ago, a young man named Jesse Hagopian, who's got a new book out called Teach Truth. And Jesse told us that in Florida, the government of Florida has been so adamant about banning books that talk about stuff like GLBTQ plus issues, trans issues. And he said there are schools in Florida that have banned the dictionary because the dictionary has homosexuality in it. And so they've actually, now that's like, good Lord, that, we know who our enemies are and what we can expect. That's some crazy shit. You're gonna ban the dictionary? And he said, it is. So, yeah, say again, NPSM.
It's the
Yep.
NSPM 7 from
Yep.
memorandum from Blondie. Actually, I don't think it was from Blondie herself.
Yeah.
DOJ did it.
And this is a This is to bust you before you actually do anything. Yeah,
And define Antifa as an organization
And-
that's a terrorist group.
right, right.
They already arrested people on trial in Texas because of it.
Yes, yes, they have.
They were arrested for that.
Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi, thank you for being here and for everyone who set this up. I learned a lot. It was great. Two things. My union, I'm on the education committee, and we're starting a podcast. It's ATU Local 1005,
Great.
Amalgamated Transit Union, so Metro Transit drivers, mechanics, etc. We had, is today Tuesday? No, yesterday was Tuesday. I don't know what day it is. We had our monthly meeting yesterday for the education committee, and we have 2 or 3 episodes, and our union president wanted to, listen to them first before they were released to make sure nobody's gonna, get themselves in trouble. It's not history yet. It's actually some current. We have under our union the Rochester, Minnesota Transit drivers and workers, and there's been a lot of crap going on down there. And so the first episodes are interviews and some information about that. If you look on Facebook, ATU Local 1005 or 1005, we have a Facebook page for our local, and there is a link on there to that, to those podcasts. So given that I'm part of one of the unions that our union can't encourage sick outs, striking, work slowdown, that kind of thing. So it's not really a question, but just can you speak to that in relation to this general strike, or do we change the wording? How do we approach that? Because there's been a lot of debates, disagreement about this within our union, and we're currently under contract negotiations. So that's part of the reason some people are they're really cautious about being involved. And our union was a sponsor on the list of sponsors on January 23rd. And there's some members of our union that had a big problem with that. So we thought the May Day one would be enough time to say, hey, we can be a sponsor, but here's what that means. But that didn't go through that meeting to be a sponsor. But people are really, they're afraid, which is what companies and government wants us to be afraid. It's frustrating. So can you speak to that? What unions can do, what union members can do, what people can do to, I don't even know how to phrase it as a question, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah. I'm not going to give you advice, but I will say that I had a conversation a couple of days ago with several people from different unions in healthcare. And they were talking about ways that they would commit that on May 1st, that they would have a conversation with patients about the issues. And so they couldn't call in sick or go on strike. They needed to be there to provide the health care. But in addition to the health care they might be providing, they might also have an informed conversation about the issues of the day. And so I don't know if your contract forbids the drivers from handing leaflets to passengers, for instance. I don't know. Or are there, conversations that drivers might have? I don't know. And I'm recalling there was a great, I guess they were streetcars, a great streetcar workers strike in Northampton, Massachusetts in like 1914. And what the workers did was they went to work, they ran the streetcars, and they refused to collect fares. So it could be an occasion for some creativity and thinking about what are the kinds of things that perhaps we could do, particularly without alienating the public.
Sometimes fare boxes don't work.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Or what I've told my members, because I work at the hospital, you got my ass for 8 hours. You can kiss my ass, what I do with the other 16.
Huh. Yes,
Following up on that.
yes.
Just yesterday for a 50-51 event, as a matter of fact, where we were tabling, and I wasn't directed at me, but the woman next to me that was tabling, someone that was there for politics and for everything, she was engaged with one of our tablers about how the strikes, May 1st, there's local businesses. It's not right not to support local businesses. And I think we were all like, no one's saying don't support local businesses. But she was so hung up on the strike and not going and not spending money and all. And I was just sitting back watching this going, I think you're missing the gist of the message here. But what would you say, what would you have said in that situation? Or what could I have interjected and kind of course corrected her gently of what the movement is all about? It's not about anti-local business. It just stuck with me.
Well, I think that part of what was so meaningful about January 23rd was, how many non-union workers participated and how many small immigrant businesses participated. And I think in our neighborhood on the east side of St. Paul, we're seeing the businesses have had a really hard time through the whole period of the Metro surge. And are there positive strategies that our organizations, whether it's 50501 or Indivisible or a union, are there positive strategies like a shop-in, to create more business on Thursday, April 30th? Or are there ways to try to balance out what might be lost on May 1st? And we're about to have an art crawl in St. Paul, and some people are talking about could we add a dimension to the art crawl of a crawl that goes to small immigrant businesses and tries to get them more business on a given day or a couple of days. So, I think these are all opportunities to try to be creative.
And turn it around to a positive with her.
Into something positive, exactly. Rather than just being defensive, yeah.
I'm trying to find some exact dates, but there is a Dine and Demonstrate coming up in the Frogtown neighborhood, being put on by the People's Action Coalition against Trump. So again, like a lot of social organizations are trying to support local and immigrant-owned businesses, all the while. Sorry, Rose, the hand?
My name is. Hey, I'm Kieran. I'm a member of CWA Local 7250 and also Black Cat Workers Collective. And just bouncing off some of these last couple of questions, I just wanted to throw out some pieces of information. One is that I know in some unions, there's been a real struggle and debate and discussion about May Day, but I also think that even if you didn't win out on getting an endorsement, just the fact that workers in a particular union are debating whether to join in on this day of political strike is a huge step forward. It's really great, and I would really, the ideas Peter raised are really great, but probably also need maybe a lot of organizing to happen. So if those things couldn't happen, even bringing a contingent down to the 4:30 march on Lake Street, and was something that identified, like ATU workers for justice or whatever it might be, would be fantastic. And the Workers' Solidarity Circle and the Workers' Assembly are going to have our own sound truck in the march. And so I'd really welcome you and any other group of workers here, whether you're in a union or not, but encourage you to bring your coworkers as a group together, because that is a workers' action, you know? And I think that would be great to build on. And then the question about small business, I think you're right, Peter, to point out how many small businesses participated in January 23rd. And there isn't really a unified agreement on that for May 1st. Like, the Workers' Assembly kind of went along with the no work, no shopping, no school, just because that had been the slogan before. But the SEIU coalition is organizing people to, which I also agree with and think is good, is organizing people to do a big party at Central Mercado at Lake and Bloomington after the march. So there is going to be an encouragement for everybody to shop at the local businesses on Lake and Bloomington, particularly the immigrant businesses that are there.
Any other questions?
Hi, my name's Erica. I have a question about the utility of the strike. So it would be a one-day thing, then it's over. How can that have long-term impact? And do you think it is more, is the utility of the strike more in that, as Steven Pinker says, when everybody knows what everybody else knows, so we can now look at each other and identify, oh yes, you were thinking like me, and maybe we can do something. And then also, after the strike, the importance of turning that action into something that can have lasting change. Maybe there's examples of things other strikes have achieved longer term.
So I think that was what I was trying to communicate, that the way things have happened in the past. And I think that it's the conversations that we have with people between now and May 1st is frankly more important than what happens on May 1st itself. And then, you know, part of those conversations become where do we want to go in the medium run and the longer run. And we've been recently going to meetings that Unidos Monarca has been holding about defending democracy and encouraging us to create block organizations. So, you know, how do these become reasons to become better organized? And as we become better organized, then hopefully we have even more focused conversations about what are our priorities in terms of issues and what are the strategies that we're able to use. So it was very frustrating around the last No Kings protest that the media decided that the narrative was it's a one-day thing, they don't have any plan for what they're going to do next, big effing deal. And it was very frustrating that from the New York Times to the Star Tribune, and I even had the experience of being misquoted by a reporter so that my comments appeared to affirm that skepticism about the day. And it really was, the important thing was what got people there in the first place, and what are all those wonderful handmade signs that people express themselves through. And you know, I think let's have as many conversations with our neighbors, with our fellow workers, with our extended families, as many conversations as we can.
I just want to say thank you to Peter. Everyone give Peter a round of applause. I'm feeling super inspired after that personally. I hope all of you are too. I really love the connecting with, you know, the events that came before, and another through line, you know, we were talking about the tactics that power used, finding a friendly judge, talking to their other robber baron friends. That goes back way further than the 1800s too. That goes back since the invention of capital, goes back since, you know, the invention of labor, really. And they're still using the same tactics, and like you pointed out, you know, the people are always innovating, and it's just a constant generational struggle, but, you know, a lot of sacrifices have been made. A along the way by workers, and it's up to us to make sure that those have meaning and that those bring us to where we need to go, to an actual system that works by and for the people. So I'm feeling super inspired by that history. Thank you so much again.